You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Under King Louis XVI's rule, France found itself deep in an economic crisis. This trouble stemmed partly from the hefty costs of jumping into the American Revolution, not to mention the backward tax system and several years of poor crops in the late 1780s. When Finance Minister Calonne took over from Jacques Necker, he thought he could solve the problem by spending extravagantly to show off the monarchy's supposed wealth, hoping this display would secure more loans. This plan, however, just dug a deeper financial hole for Louis. On May 5, 1789, the Estates General gathered to try and sort out this mess. However, their efforts were hampered by outdated procedures and the resistance of the Second Estate, the nobility, who were less than 2% of France's population but held significant power. By June 17, 1789, the Third Estate, which was made up of commoners, took matters into its own hands. They formed the National Assembly, aiming to create a new constitution for France. The king wasn't a fan at first, but eventually had to accept the Assembly's authority. Shortly after, on July 9th, the Assembly got a new title, the National Constituent Assembly. In Paris, there was a buzz of excitement for change. Historian François Mignet described the city as intoxicated with liberty and enthusiasm, with strong support shown for the Assembly. The debates and political discussions weren't just confined to the Assembly. They spilled out into public spaces and the press, igniting widespread engagement. One of the pivotal moments came when a crowd, spurred by a meeting at the Palais Royal, stormed the Abbaye prison to free some grenadiers of the French guards locked up for refusing to shoot at civilians. The Assembly suggested that the king show mercy to these guardsmen. They would return to prison for a day as a symbolic gesture before being pardoned. This act showed that even the military, previously seen as loyal to the crown, was starting to support the cause of the people. On the 11th of July in 1789, King Louis XVI, influenced by the more conservative members of his close advisers, made the significant decision to dismiss his finance minister, Jacques Necker, who was popular with the Third Estate, and to overhaul his entire ministry team. He introduced new members like the Marshals Victor François, Duke of Broglie, La Galissonière, the Duc de la Vauguyon, the Baron Louis de Breteuil, and Joseph Fouillon de Douai, to take over the roles previously held by Puiségur, Armand Marc, Count de Montmorin, La Luzerne, Saint-Priest, and Necker. The news of Necker being removed from his position reached the streets of Paris on the afternoon of the 12th of July. The people of Paris did not react well, interpreting this as the start of a conservative shift in power. The already worsening mood wasn't helped by the king's decision to bring in royal troops from the borders to various strategic locations, including Versailles and Paris, sparking fears that the work of the National Constituent Assembly in Versailles could be forcibly halted. Tens of thousands of people gathered around the city, with over 10,000 at the Palais Royal alone. A notable moment occurred when Camille Desmoulins, standing on a table with a pistol, called to arms, declaring that Necker's dismissal was a signal for a crackdown on patriots that very night. It's important to note that the foreign mercenaries in the Royal Army, such as the Swiss and German battalions, were not supportive of the popular cause, accounting for about half of the 25,000 regular troops in Paris and Versailles at the time. Their presence alongside certain French regiments believed to be loyal to the royal court intensified the tensions. Amid these growing tensions on the 12th of July, crowds marched through Paris with busts of Necker and Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, to show their support. This escalated when they clashed with the Royal German Cavalry Regiment, ultimately leading to Charles Eugene, Prince of Lambesc, ordering a cavalry charge that dispersed the remaining demonstrators at what is now the Place de la Concorde. Fearing a massacre or his troops defecting, the royal commander withdrew his forces. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Paris was one of increasing unrest, with people expressing their frustration by targeting locations blamed for high food and wine prices. This agitation turned into direct action when rumors spread that food was being hoarded at Saint-Lazare, leading to a mob breaking in and taking a large quantity of wheat. This act of defiance was part of broader actions that day, with people looting for food, guns, and supplies, while the royal troops stood by, doing nothing to halt the chaos unfolding in Paris. The French Guards, who were essentially the standing army in Paris and had strong community ties, initially stayed out of the fray during the early disturbances in mid-July. However, as Paris spiraled into widespread riots, Charles Eugene, doubting the regiment's loyalty, positioned 60 dragoons outside their headquarters in the Chaussée d'Antin, just to keep a watchful eye on them. Despite the officers' attempts to gather their troops, the French Guards ended up siding with the rioters, effectively giving the rebels a trained military force. This development made the leaders of the other royal troops stationed at the Champ de Mars question whether they could really rely on any of their forces. Louis-Philippe, who later became known as the Citizen King, was a young officer at the time. He believed that the soldiers would have followed orders if pressured, and later reflected that the French Guards officers had dropped the ball by allowing non-commissioned officers to take too much control before the uprising. The hesitant command of Besenval essentially led to the royal authority losing its grip in central Paris. On July 13th, Paris's electors decided to form a bourgeois militia of 48,000 men from across the city's voting districts to restore order. These men were identified by blue and red cockades, the colours of Paris. The next day, Lafayette was named the leader of this group, which he quickly renamed the National Guard. On July 27th, he added white, the royal colour, to the cockade, creating the iconic French tricolour. On July 14th, 1789, Paris was on edge. Members of the Third Estate, supported by the bourgeois militia of Paris, soon to be known as the National Guard, had earlier seized the Hôtel des Invalides to get their hands on 29,000 to 32,000 muskets, although they found no ammunition. The commandant at the Invalides had wisely moved 250 barrels of gunpowder to the Bastille for safekeeping just days before. At that time, the Bastille, a fortress seen as a symbol of the king's absolute power, held only 7 prisoners. These included 4 forgers, an Irishman deemed insane and suspected of spying, a man who had attempted to kill Louis XV 30 years prior, and a deviant aristocrat, all held for various reasons. The infamous Marquis de Sade had been transferred out shortly before after causing a stir. Despite its few prisoners, the Bastille was defended by veteran soldiers and reinforced with troops and artillery. The fortress was already slated for demolition, considered too expensive to maintain for its limited use. Yet, as tensions rose that July, it stood as the ultimate symbol of royal oppression. The assaulting crowd, under 1,000 people mainly comprised of local craftsmen, army deserters, and notably 21 wine merchants, demanded the withdrawal of the fortress's guns and release of the stored gunpowder. Negotiations began but dragged on, leading the crowd to eventually storm the Bastille. Violence broke out, inadvertently triggered and intensified as both sides misunderstood the other's intentions. The situation escalated until the fortress's governor, Bernard-René de Launay, surrendered at 5:30 p.m. after a day of fighting, fearing his forces couldn't last with their limited supplies. 98 attackers and 1 defender died, with the attackers gaining protection from the fortress walls. Caught in the aftermath, Governor de Launay was killed by the crowd after a tumultuous confrontation. Shockingly, the violence also claimed the heads of 2 notable figures, displayed on pikes as witnessed by an English traveller, painting a gruesome picture of the day's events. Further, the mob killed the mayor Jacques de Flesselles, accusing him of betrayal. The king, Louis XVI, learned of the event the following day, famously questioning if it was a revolt. "No, sire, it's not a revolt, it's a revolution," he was told, underlining the monumental significance of the storming of the Bastille. While some argue the beginning of the French Revolution lies with earlier events, the fall of the Bastille symbolizes the first major action by Paris's common people, the sans-culottes, in the revolutionary struggle, marking a pivotal moment in French history. At Versailles, for several hours, the assembly was mostly in the dark about what was happening in Paris. Despite this, there was a lingering worry among the representatives that Marshal de Broglie might launch a pro-royalist coup. This coup would force them to agree to the decrees made on the 23rd of June, and then dissolve the assembly. It seems like Noailles was the first to deliver fairly accurate updates from Paris to Versailles. Following his lead, Monsieur Ganil and Bancal des Isards, who were sent to the Hôtel de Ville, backed up his information. By the morning of the 15th of July, it became evident to the king and his military leaders as well that their position was untenable, leading them to back down. The 23 royal regiments that had been amassed around Paris were sent off to their posts on the frontier. The Marquis de Lafayette stepped in to lead the National Guard in Paris. Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who was a key figure in the Third Estate and pivotal in the tennis court oath, was made the city's mayor in a newly established government setup, known as the Commune de Paris. The king made a move to show he was aligning with the people by announcing his decision to bring back Necker and to move from Versailles back to Paris. On the 17th of July, during a visit to Paris, the king was welcomed with a blue and red cockade from Bailly and entered the Hôtel de Ville to the sound of cheers saying, "Long live the king and long live the nation." Right after the chaos of July 14th, many nobles, who weren't exactly convinced by the brief peace between the king and the public, decided to pack up and leave France. Among the first ones out were the Count of Artois, who would later become King Charles X of France, along with his two sons. Other significant figures like the Prince de Condé, the Prince de Conti, the Polignac family, and a bit later, Charles-Alexandre de Calonne, who used to manage the country's finances, joined the exit. They ended up in Touraine, where Calonne started working on behalf of the Count of Artois and the Prince de Condé. Their plan? Stir up civil war back in France and get other European countries to come together against France. Meanwhile, back in France, the news of the uprising in Paris spread far and wide. Embracing the idea that the people should have the power, citizens started setting up their own local governments and militias. In the countryside, the reaction was even more intense. During a period known as the Great Fear, from July 20th to August 5th, people went as far as burning legal documents and a good number of mansions, driven by the fear that the nobles were plotting to squash the revolution. Just 2 days after the storming of the Bastille, on July 16, 1789, John Frederick Sackville, the British ambassador to France, wrote to Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs Francis Osborne, the 5th Duke of Leeds. He said, "Thus, my lord, the greatest revolution we know of has happened with, relatively speaking, especially considering how huge this event is, the loss of very few lives. From now on we can see France as a country of freedom, the king with much less power, and the nobility on the same level as everyone else." On July 22, 1789, things took a darker turn when Joseph Fouillon de Douai, the Controller General of Finances, and his son-in-law were killed by the people. Both had been key officials under the monarchy. About 900 people who claimed they were part of the Bastille takeover were given special certificates by the National Assembly in 1790, and several of these certificates are still around today. Even though there were suggestions to keep the Bastille standing either as a tribute to freedom or as a storage facility for the newly formed National Guard, the Paris Town Hall's Permanent Committee of Municipal Electors decided otherwise. They hired Pierre-François Palloy, a construction entrepreneur, to take the building apart. Palloy did not waste any time and quickly had around 1,000 workers on the job. In just 5 months, they managed not only to demolish the fortress, but also to melt down a clock that showed prisoners in chains and to break apart 4 statues. In 1790, the key to the Bastille, a heavy, wrought iron key weighing over 1 pound, was handed over to United States President George Washington by Lafayette. Washington made sure this key was seen, showcasing it at various government events in New York and Philadelphia all the way up until he was about to retire in 1797. Today, you can still see this key at Washington's home, Mount Vernon. Palloy didn't stop with just tearing down the Bastille. He also took bricks from the ruins and crafted them into miniature versions of the fortress, which he then sold alongside medals he claimed were made from the prisoners' chains. He sent pieces of stone from the Bastille to every district in France, and some of these pieces have been found. There are other remnants of the Bastille around as well, including stones that were used in constructing the Pont de la Concorde bridge over the Seine River and one of its towers that was unearthed in 1899. This tower is now at Square Henri Galli in Paris. Additionally, the clock's bells and pulley system are kept in the Musée d'Art Campanaire. The outline of the building, as well as its moat, are marked in brick at the site where the Bastille once stood. This is visible from the Paris metro stop below it, where a part of the foundation is also displayed for people to see. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.